going on, guys? PC here. In this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Recently, I decided I wanted to kind of browse through some Sega patents on Google Patents, and I found some really interesting stuff. Now, most of this has to do with the Dreamcast controller. Well, it's kind of questionable whether some of these are referring to the Saturn or the Dreamcast, but they were kind of in between. So you can see as we go through these that a lot of these inspired the Dreamcast controller design. And if you know anything about how the Dreamcast controller was designed, you know that the Saturn 3D pad was basically a prototype for the Dreamcast controller. In fact, in some very early Dreamcast renderings and things like that, you'll see that they actually did use the Saturn 3D pad as a Dreamcast controller, and even the same connector as well. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of inspiration there for the Dreamcast. A lot of the ideas from the Saturn were moved over to the Dreamcast after the Saturn was discontinued. But yeah, anyway, let's just go through these, and you're gonna be pretty surprised at some of the stuff you see in here. Some stuff never actually was released, and some of these ideas never actually happened. So it's really interesting to look through this stuff. But here's the first patent here. This is from 1996, so around the Saturn era, of course. So this, as you can see, is a Sega Saturn 3D pad. Nothing too special there. But what's interesting is what comes after that. So if you continue on, as you can see, you have the removable controller cord, which is something that the Saturn 3D pad had. You can actually detach the controller cord, and theoretically you could replace it with other things, but that never actually happened. So as is, it's just a detachable controller cord. I mean, in itself, it's a good idea, because if the cord ever breaks, you could just buy a new cord instead of buying an entire new controller. So it's actually a really good design. But they had a lot of other plans for this. And I mean, when you think about it, you can do a lot of different things. You could replace the controller cord with a longer one. Just a really simple idea, but a really useful idea. Instead of buying an extension cord for it, you could just replace the cord with a longer one. A really interesting and simple idea for the detachable controller cord design. But there was a lot more to it, and you'll see that later in the patents here. So I'm going to scroll through here. Just more designs here showing the connector. Let me scroll through some of this. Some of it's not that interesting. This is one of the most interesting images. As you can see here, they have a design for what appears to be a wireless receiver or wireless transmitter. So you can actually have a wireless adapter for the controller, which is really interesting. So you can replace the cord with a wireless receiver or wireless transmitter, whatever. But you also have what appears to be a battery here, which is obviously you need a battery if you're not going to be directly connected to the Saturn to power the controller. So why it has a actual controller connector at the end of it, I don't know. Maybe for recharging possibly, but it'd be kind of awkward with this cord hanging off the back of the controller. But either way, it clearly is a battery, and you also have the transmitter here. So yeah, a wireless controller was something that they had as an idea, and that could have easily been adapted for the Dreamcast as well. So I mean, obviously the Dreamcast controller had two VMU slots, very similar design to what they had for the detachable controller cord for the Saturn 3D pad. Now here's another interesting one. This is an attachable joystick. You could potentially use this for arcade games, obviously. Instead of having a whole separate arcade stick, you could have an arcade stick that plugs into the regular controller. So that's a really cool design as well. Here's another one. I don't know exactly what this is. It looks like some sort of second analog stick, or possibly a joystick that actually goes to the side of the controller. I don't know how that would work, because the actual connector's in the back of the controller, obviously. So I don't know how this would work, but maybe it's just a different controller altogether. But no, actually I can see there's a screw here to screw into the back of the controller. So yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting modular controller design. Here's some sort of what appears to be an analog nub of some sort, or a ball possibly. I don't know. Just all these different attachments. There's something that goes on the bottom of the controller. It's kind of like the one that went on the side, except it goes on the bottom. They had so many different ideas. Here's another one with a memory card slot on it, which is very reminiscent of the Dreamcast controller, obviously. You have the memory card slot, and then another, well, see, this appears to be one attachable unit where you have a memory card slot in the actual detachable cord connector. So that's another interesting design. And here, we're starting to get more towards what the Dreamcast had on the Dreamcast controller, because you have a screen on this one. What's kind of weird, though, is it actually calls it a time display unit. So it's kind of like a clock on the top of the Dreamcast controller, or the Saturn controller. Why you would want a clock there, I don't know. It's interesting. It's a clock with a couple different buttons here. I don't know if these are buttons, but I can't really tell. But yeah, I mean, this is just really, really intriguing. Here's another one which I find kind of odd. It looks like a controller mount of some sort. I can't figure this one out. It looks like almost a foot pedal. I don't know. I don't know what that would be used for. It says rotation angle detecting units. I think this might be some sort of steering controller, possibly. Maybe you would actually move the controller on a tilt of some sort. That's interesting. Yeah, but that's just kind of a weird one, though. Here's another one where you're rotating the controller on some sort of stand. That's interesting. So many different ideas. It's just like they were popping off all these random ideas, and they thought, oh, we'll just throw all these in the patent documents. But yeah, that's just a regular controller design. I have no idea what that is. Just a connector of some sort. Here's another controller entirely. This is, as far as I can tell, a controller that was never released. It's a 6-button controller, which 3D pad wasn't 6-button, was it? Oh yeah, it was. Okay, never mind. Yeah, so it's just a different controller design altogether. Very interesting. So yeah, that's pretty much all that's in this particular patent. Just a modular controller design. Very, very similar to what the Dreamcast ended up being. It was a very modular controller, except it didn't have a detachable controller cord, which would have been nice. Again, for convenience or for affordability, in case your controller cord breaks, you can just replace it. Or again, maybe replace it with a wireless transmitter, which would have been really, really cool. But unfortunately, they never did that with the Dreamcast. Although, technically, the Dreamcast controller cord is detachable. You just have to open the controller, and it just plugs right in. So it's actually pretty easy to replace, but not this easy to replace. But yeah, a very, very interesting patent here, with a lot of interesting ideas, some of which made it over to the Dreamcast, others were pretty much just scrapped. So yeah, that's that patent. So moving on to the next one here. This, as you can see, is, it's described as input device, game device, and method and recording medium. So, just kind of a weird name, but as you can see from the picture here, that is clearly the Dreamcast fishing controller, which is attached to a Saturn, but I find that a lot of the patents that have to do with the Dreamcast, they actually used the Saturn as a representation of the console in the patent. So this is definitely for the Dreamcast, unless they did plan the fishing controller for the Saturn, but I kind of doubt it. This patent is from 1997, so at that point they would have been moving on to the Dreamcast. So they probably just used the Saturn just for the sake of it. They already had an image of the Saturn, copy and paste, put it in the patent there. But yeah, fishing controller. Nothing too special here. Fishing controller was released as a really cool peripheral for the Dreamcast, but the interesting stuff comes later. So if you look later here, you'll see a couple other designs for controllers, including a sword controller. So they didn't want to just stop at a fishing controller. They went to other things, other designs that might be interesting to use in a game like a sword. I mean, just imagine using this in something like Mach-N X. That would have been amazing. I mean, move over Wii. Wii what? This Sega really pioneered motion controls on a console with a fishing controller, and they could have taken it even farther, which is proof in this document here. So yeah, you had a sword controller, which would have been really cool, and also a baseball bat and a golf club controller. So sports taken to the next level here. But yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Stuff that was never released. They obviously had an idea to go beyond the fishing controller and maybe look into other different things, but unfortunately never happened. I mean, this patent is definitely specific to the fishing controller, and it looks like they just kind of added these extra ideas to the end. But yeah, it's really interesting to see what could have been. And moving on to the final patent, which is described as a memory device, controller, and electronic device. As you can see, it is clearly a very early rendition of the Dreamcast VMU. This patent was from 1997, same as the other one. So again, this is kind of leading up to the Dreamcast after the Saturn was discontinued. So they're planning out these things, including the VMU. And as you can see, it's a very square and boxy looking VMU with 3 buttons on it. Definitely not the final design, but you'll see the final design as we go through these different images here. So let's move on to, this is just kind of showing the internals, RAM, CPU, whatever, connector on the top. I'm going to skip some of these because they're not very interesting. More renders. This is closer to the final design. Obviously, you have the D-pad here and the 2 buttons. So moving on here. This is interesting. This is kind of the crossroads between the Dreamcast and the Saturn controller. Here you have what is clearly a Saturn 3D pad, except it has a VMU slot on the top. But yeah, it's really, really interesting to see where these ideas kind of merge together into this controller. And obviously they didn't change the controller design at this point. They're just kind of showing, hey, this is our idea for the display unit, which will plug into the top of the controller. So again, they're just kind of using existing images, I think, and adapting ideas for it. So they have the VMU attached to a Saturn 3D pad here. Now, this next one is really interesting as well. Now, it doesn't look that interesting. It just looks like 2 VMUs that are connected together. But the thing is, it's a cable that connects the 2. If you wanted to connect 2 VMUs, you can do that, but you connect them directly. You don't use a cable. So what this suggests to me is that at some point they were thinking of maybe we could do some multiplayer VMU games where each player would have their own VMU and you could connect them together with some sort of cable. Because as is, you can't really play multiplayer games with 2 VMUs, because if you connect them together, you can't really access the buttons. Your hands would go over the screen to get to the buttons, and the buttons would be upside down, so it's not really practical. But this design suggests that they might have released a cable at some point, which would actually allow you to do multiplayer games. I mean, it's not really saying that here, but it suggests that idea to me anyway, just by looking at it. Really interesting. So next up we have, let's see, we have another image of a 3D pad with a VMU, just kind of giving some ideas of what you could do with the VMU. And here, see, here's the screen, and it would show the actual cards for your for one particular player on the VMU. So that's one idea, and that's one idea that was used in a lot of Dreamcast games. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, but you have games like Sonic Shuffle, which showed your cards on the VMU, just like it does here. You also have the NFL 2K games, which show your plays on the VMU, just information that you wouldn't want the other players to see. It's a really good use of the VMU. So again, more images like that, just kind of showing different examples of what you could do with a second screen on the controller. This is a game of Tetris. This is, it's actually showing on the screen here, is this game download. It's kind of bad English there, but I assume what it's insinuating there is that you can download a mini version of Tetris onto the VMU. So yeah, that's obviously something that did happen. I don't know about Tetris, but a lot of games did have you download little mini games onto the VMU. There's a fighting mini game that you could download onto the VMU here. So it says training mode on the screen. Carried for improving perimeter of game data. Again, this text really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Probably bad translations, but there's another early VMU render with 3 buttons instead of 2, which is interesting. Here's obviously 2 VMUs connected together. This one is really strange. This shows a really, really square controller with a VMU that's being plugged into it. That has to be the worst controller design I've ever seen. I have no idea what the point of this image was. Clearly that wasn't a controller design they were considering, but yeah, it's just kind of a weird one in here. Same thing, just on with different angles and things. Another 3D pad with a VMU. This is kind of interesting. This one shows it shows the VMU. It looks like it's connected to the console itself, because here's the controller connected to the front, and the VMU is actually connected to the top of the console. That's interesting. It'd be kind of strange. I don't know why you'd want to do that. I mean, you couldn't even see the screen from the distance that you're sitting from the console generally. So I don't know why they would do that, but that's interesting. I mean, maybe in circumstances where you don't actually need to see the screen, if you just wanted to save things to it. But yeah, that's interesting. This is another interesting design. This is a completely different controller. It looks a lot like the ASCII fight pad. So this is theoretically some sort of fighting controller with a VMU slot. And see, the fighting controller, it did have a VMU slot, but it didn't have a place to view the screen. So if you put the VMU in the controller, you couldn't actually see the screen for it. It was strictly for saving. So this is an interesting design. Also, Sega didn't release their own fighting controller. It was released by ASCII. So yeah, again, another interesting design. I know I'm saying interesting a whole lot in this video, but that really describes this perfectly. Just looking through all this stuff. Now here's the final controller design for the Dreamcast, or kind of. It actually looks like the prototype controller that Bernie Stolar is holding in a picture that you see online, a pretty famous picture. It's a red Dreamcast controller, and it actually has a round start button, which was changed obviously later to a triangular shaped start button. But yeah, this is pretty much the final design for the controller. Here's somewhat of a final design for the console itself. Obviously a lot more rounded than the final Dreamcast console design. The controllers kind of, or the controllers, yeah. The corners kind of dip down a lot more than the actual final design, and they're rounded on the corners, which, yeah, on the final design is more sharp, more of a sharp corner. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this patent here. I don't think there's anything too interesting. Here's the angle you should be looking at your controller if you're a Cyclops. But yeah, here's another one for the microphone. But actually, this is a really interesting design because the microphone is actually in the slot for the screen. So this is actually a very different microphone design. Rather than having the microphone come out the back of the adapter, it would actually be in the screen slot, which I can see why they changed it later, because obviously you can't have a VMU and the microphone in there because it would block the microphone. I mean, you could have the VMU in the back slot, I suppose, but then you wouldn't be able to see the screen, so it's not really a practical design, so I can see why they changed that. Still interesting to see the original design for it. This is a weird design. I actually don't even remember looking at this before. It appears to be 4 buttons in the middle of the screen slot. That would be really, really impractical. I mean, I guess for functions that you don't use very often, you know, just kind of menu options, or I don't know. I mean, I guess you could find some use for it, but I can see it's kind of impractical. And why would you buy this expansion card just for this? So yeah, I mean, it's another idea that they kind of threw around, I guess, that never really made it into anything. But this is interesting. I don't know what this is supposed to be. Oh, it's a camera. Oh, well, that's really interesting. So at some point, they were gonna make a camera that you could plug into the Dreamcast controller. Wow, I missed this one before, and this is actually one of the coolest designs I've seen. So potentially you could have some sort of like a webcam that would record your face. I don't know if that would be used online. I mean, it could potentially. I mean, the DreamEye camera was used online, so you could video chat with other players. This may be not for that, I don't know. But definitely an interesting design. It's more of a webcam sort of thing where, you know, you could actually move around the camera rather than the fixed stationary DreamEye camera. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, really, really cool there. Anything else that I missed here? It's another connector design. This is a different connector design than the final one, I believe. And 2 VMUs connected together. So yeah, that is pretty much it. This is some really, really fascinating stuff. I love looking through things like this to see just kind of what was going through Sega's head when they designed their controller. They had this 3D pad controller for the Saturn that they had a lot of plans for, but the Saturn obviously was discontinued very early and all this stuff was moved over to the Dreamcast, but it all stemmed from that one 3D controller and its modular design where you could add different components to it and make it better, change the way it works, and it's just so many really, really cool and unique ideas that Sega had. And obviously some of this made it over to the Dreamcast. We had that VMU screen, and we had obviously 2 expansion slots for rumble packs, for microphones, and different things like that. But to see these patents and to see the various other cool things that we could have had, like a wireless adapter or, I don't know, a sword controller. I mean, that wasn't really part of the modular controller design, but that's cool as well. Yeah, I mean, various adapters for various things, joysticks, whatever. It's all just so awesome. I love looking through stuff like this, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. I really had to make a video on this because half of this information I don't remember seeing. I'd say the majority of this information I don't remember seeing anywhere online. I don't remember anyone mentioning any of it. So I thought this would make for a perfect video, just a really fascinating video. At least this is something that really fascinates me, and I hope it does you as well. But anyway, guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment, rate, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.